Anaclitic Countertransference, Chapter 9 by Paul Geltner, 2011. Part 1. In Anaclitic Countertransference, the analyst experiences feelings towards the patient that the patient needs in order to mature. The Anaclitic Countertransference is induced by the Anaclitic transference in which the patient experiences needs for feelings that would enable him to mature. Together, they create a transference/countertransference mode that resembles the emotional environment of a well-attuned parent-child relationship. The distinguishing feature of the Anaclitic transference is that the patient re-experiences the need for feelings, specific maturational emotional communications, that were lacking or insufficient in his life prior to entering analysis. These needs are usually the same as those he experienced as a child in relationship to the parents or would have experienced with his parents had the relationship been optimal. It is possible that his needs were not met, were met inconsistently, or met with insufficient strength to sustain him through later periods of stress. In any case, the patient re-experiences them in the transference relationship to the analyst. Moreover, he does not manifest defenses against having his needs met. On the contrary, he is ready and eager to have them met by the analyst. It is this last feature that indicates the analyst's feelings are truly anaclitic and not simply subjective nurturing feelings. The patient may experience the analyst either narcissistically or as a different object. He may be extremely regressed in the transference going back to the earliest infantile states, but he can also function as an older child, adolescent, or even as an adult child. Conversely, the analyst is never regressed in the anaclitic mode. He experiences the patient as a separate object towards whom he consistently experiences adult, caretaking feelings with a keen sense of the patient's emotional needs at the moment. He is frequently empathic with the patient, but this is not essential. The distinguishing feature of the Anaclitic countertransference is that the analyst has the desire and the ability to meet the patient's emotional needs. This is the opposite emotional situation from the object countertransference in which the analyst's feelings, and the transference/countertransference as a whole, repeats a pathological interaction from the patient's earlier life. The Anaclitic mode, therefore, expresses a different form of repetition than what is seen in the object mode and from other forms of countertransference. The patient's contribution is a repetition. He repeats the experience of needing specific emotional communications from a parental figure and attempts to induce the required feelings in a parental figure. The analyst's contribution, on the other hand, is not necessarily a repetition. If the parent responded to the child's neediness with maturational emotional communications, then the analyst's feelings may be a repetition, but if the parent did not, the analyst's desire and ability to meet the patient's emotional needs may be a completely new experience in the patient's life. Practically speaking, it makes no difference whether the analyst's feelings are new or are repetitive. Once the patient successfully induces anaclitic feelings in the analyst, the patient's unmet needs are gratified, and the maturational process restarts. The anaclitic mode begins in the repetition of a need and ends in maturation. General features of anaclitic countertransference. Anaclitic countertransference comprises feelings that are identical to ordinary parental love. These feelings often feel primitive and unprofessional. And because the proper analytic stance has been associated with neutrality, abstinence, and the image of the cool-hearted surgeon, parental feelings towards patients have often been viewed as non-analytic, something to be outgrown or analyzed away. Even schools that are removed from classical analytic technique often seem to look for a more sophisticated emotional response to the patient than what is involved in very ordinary parental caretaking. For example, hating the patient feels like a serious analytic issue, whereas wanting to give the patient a lollipop does not. Furthermore, consideration of these types of feelings has often been tied up with technical issues. Modern analytic theorists have been concerned that expressing positive feelings too early in the treatment can inhibit the patient from expressing aggression towards the analyst. Relational theorists, e.g. Mitchell 1988, have been concerned that these types of feelings, although they do not use the term anaclitic, infantilize the patient. Nevertheless, if an analyst can separate the technical issues from the immediate emotional reaction to the patient that constitutes the countertransference, it is obvious that anaclitic countertransference will be a significant component of the analyst's feelings with most patients at some point in their treatment. What makes these feelings potent is not their content, which is often quite ordinary, but that the patient needs them at that particular moment in the treatment. Occasionally, anaclitic countertransference can be quite dramatic. One of the most striking examples I experienced was with a disorganized schizophrenic man I treated in a state mental hospital. My feelings during the first year or so were as far from anaclitic as could be imagined. He was filthy and drooling all the time. The only thing he seemed to be able to say was, "Got a cigarette? Got a cigarette." He repeated this over and over, sometimes 40 times per session. He started one session by asking me my name, and I was filled with hope that something new was happening. Instead, he looked at me and asked, "Mr. Geltner, can I please have a cigarette?" It was little consolation that his communication had evolved somewhat. When he wasn't asking for a cigarette, he stared blankly into space or slept. He disgusted me. At times, the only thing interesting about him were his repulsive habits, like his drool. Once, I was intrigued by a glob of spit oozing clown his lip, and watched carefully to see whether I could guess the exact moment that it would fall off of his chin and onto his pajamas. After a year, however, I began to feel more fondly towards him. Once, I looked at his face and decided that he was actually rather cute and began to have fantasies about running my fingers through his greasy hair. He looked at me with bright eyes, and I felt happy to have him in my life. By this time, he had stopped asking for cigarettes, and he had been silent for several months. After several weeks of feeling warmly towards him, I had one session in which he was particularly silent, almost coy. I had an intense fantasy in which I imagined him being an adult with his beard and all, but shrunk clown to the size of a baby. Then I envisioned myself having breasts and had him nursing and looking up at me with his sweet brown eyes. I was silently lost in this countertransference fantasy for a good chunk of the session when he began to talk. He still didn't say anything coherent, but he babbled softly, like a little baby, in a way that he never had. As much as I would like to report that this was the beginning of a spectacular cure, the truth is that he was still psychotic when I left the hospital 6 months later. Nevertheless, this interchange had been important. He became more verbal from that point on, both with me and with the ward. He began to speak sentences that made sense, sometimes 5 or 6 in a row. He could form the rudiments of a conversation. This interchange had changed something between us and had left him open to a slightly enlarged range of interpersonal relationships. Most Anaclitic countertransference is a low-key affair, examples such as this notwithstanding. As we shall see, not all Anaclitic feelings are positive or loving. But when they are, they tend to feel natural and ordinary, as might be expected, as most parenting is quite ordinary and unspectacular. Congruence and incongruence. As with all forms of countertransference, Anaclitic inductions can be congruent or incongruent. Congruent inductions clearly and obviously correspond to the content of the session. For example, the patient wants advice on how to talk to his wife, and the analyst knows just what to say and wants to tell him. In a slightly less congruent case, the patient may discuss his problems with his wife, without directly asking for advice. The analyst understands that he is not talking to her in the right way and wants to explain how he should talk to her. Or the patient is tearful and agitated after having had a fight at work, and the analyst feels that she just needs to talk to her in a soothing tone of voice to reassure her that this fight is just office politics, not the end of the world. Congruent inductions like this feel completely unremarkable and can create the misleading impression that the feeling is clinically insignificant. Incongruent inductions, on the other hand, are often noticed by the analyst because they are so out of context with what is occurring in the session. One patient induced a withdrawn, almost bored feeling in me during the first several months of treatment. Then, there was a shift, not in the overt content of the communications, which continued to focus on the details of her everyday life, but in my feelings. I found myself thinking slowly, almost chanting, "I love Rosa Golden, stern her name." This feeling continued throughout the rest of the treatment at various intervals for about 8 years. Even more striking are incongruent inductions that are completely at odds with the content. One supervisee described a patient whom I would have found to be thoroughly obnoxious. He was politically belligerent, paranoid, and condescending, and he was genuinely disliked by most everyone in his life except the analyst. And she loved him. It wasn't because he treated her any differently than he treated everyone else. But she would say, "I know people think he's difficult, but they just don't understand him. He's just like a cranky baby. All you have to do is hold him right, and he'll cuddle right up next to you." It didn't matter that nobody at that point, including the analyst, had found the way to hold him correctly. She was convinced that she would succeed in curing him through her love. Eventually she did, and other people began to love him as well. Types of Anaclitic inductions. Anaclitic object countertransference encompasses a wide variety of feelings, all the feelings a person needs to experience from other people throughout the life cycle. A complete description of all of these feelings would be a fascinating and valuable contribution to our knowledge of emotional development. The following description of Anaclitic countertransference includes only the forms that I have seen most frequently. Roughly speaking, Anaclitic inductions can be divided into 2 main categories. Inductions related to nurturing and basic caretaking, and B. Inductions related to sexual and aggressive impulses.